Да, гребущий. Что за хуй?
Start off with, he uses the same attacks you've seen before, this circular AoE, a couple of sword flurries, easy stuff. Then he jumps over here, pulls out a paddle, and the final two phases are done in 2D, which is just, it threw me for a loop. By shaking things up and surprising the player, QIWI revitalised its momentum right when I thought he was starting to run out of steam. To summarise, let's look at one more boss from QIWI, the Strap, who is the second and probably best boss in the game, and see how this all stacks up. First, the structure. She's got a varied moveset, but it's got an overall theme of teaching you the specifics of dodging. She's got these big lasers, these ranged blasts, and a few combos to keep you on your toes. This is a great challenge to teach you how QIWI works once you're out of the tutorial. Check. Second, the threat. The game does a great job of hyping her up with this big long monologue from your rabbit buddy. Her arena come prison is this dark, technological nightmarescape. She's painted as insane and enraged, in stark contrast to the bosses before and after her, and her genuinely unsettling noises and animation really sell the Strap as being a truly dangerous opponent, which is reflected in her difficulty. She's a big step up, truly dangerous opponent, which is reflected in her difficulty. She's a big step up from the Chain, who's the first boss. All that makes you feel even more dangerous when you manage to take her down. Check. Third, theme. As I mentioned before, the Strap is really unsettling. But even then, the QIWI team managed to telegraph her attacks really well. The biggest example is this big spotlight thing she's got on her face. It's a focal point for a lot of her attacks, and the colour it glows is a great way of telling the player what attack she's going to use. Blue for a big laser, orange for destructible bullets, and purple for a homing scatter shot. Finally, a twist. And this is where Little Miss Wheelie Laserface really comes into her own. As she gets more and more pissed off, she destroys more and more of her bindings, shaking up her attack patterns until she eventually transitions into crawling around like the girl from the Ring. It's a great introduction to the concept of an evolving boss fight, and the amazingly weird transitions between forms really keep you guessing. Checkaroo. QIWI is a game with, honestly, quite a few problems. The real final boss is mostly just a test of endurance and patience more so than it is actually a test of skill. The dodge is hard to gauge and leads to you jumping into projectiles a lot of the time, and the charged up versions of your attacks they're pretty worthless. But in spite of that, it's the game's relentless focus on boss fights that makes it a game I beat in, 2 sittings. Bosses have always been at the forefront of game design for a good reason. They're a place where mechanical, aesthetic and metatextual design exist in a single place to create some of the most memorable experiences in games. And that's why QIWI and its collection of weird, offbeat genius bosses stuck with me for so long.
Человеку удалось сделать.
Takes us from the quantum realm.
You can eventually start to get a feeling by looking at three-dimensional wireframes or projections of such wireframes what the four-dimensional object might indeed look like. In doing this projection, we still have an option. We can project in various different ways. We're going from a two-dimensional sphere to a three-dimensional object. And in an oblique projection, I start with the red square in front, and then the blue square is the one in the back, and the green lines essentially show me the depth. We do the same thing by starting with a complete cube. The red cube is in front, the blue cube is in the back, and then the green lines show essentially the extrusion of this cube in this oblique direction. Alternatively, we can use a perspective projection. Everything in the back would appear smaller, and we can look straight at the face. And by doing that, the back face will be a smaller square, so really behind the red square, the green lines show kind of the depth going from the front to the back. And the same we can do with the complete cube, and we get, in the back a smaller cube shown in blue, and then the edges that go from the front to the back are shown in green. So here is the oblique projection. You can see the fat cube being sort of the one in front, and then the thinner cube in the back, and then the slightly conical edges leading from the front to the back. So that's a valid depiction of a wireframe of a hypercube. And here is the alternative model, a perspective projection. So the bluish cube is the front cube, and the yellow cube is the one in the back, which is here much smaller, the red edges that go from the front to the back. And this hypercube has a total of 8 cubes. The front cube in blue, the back cube in yellow, and then some squashed cubes here showing one on each of 6 faces. So there's a total of 8 cubes making the surface or the thick crust of the hypercube.
So that yellow
Сотрудники для тех, кто развивает
No,
бизнес.
it's 4 dimensions.
Для тех,
It is all about running around a beautiful open world, solving puzzles.
It would be sort of up in the 4th dimension a certain distance, because of the first dimension of the hypercube.
So that yellow cube isn't
In 4 dimensions it would be sort of up in the 4th dimension a certain distance, because of perspective projection. Up there, it gets projected into the back and appears smaller in this section. Now we're going to systematically look at all platonic solids, see how many we can group around the shared edge, how much empty space there is, and we push that one out and push that into a valid 4D corner. The simplest object to start with is the tetrahedron. The tetrahedron has a dihedral angle of 70.5 degrees. We need at least 3 of these tetrahedrons around the edge to make a valid corner. 3 of course fits very easily, 4 fits, even 5 fits, but just barely. We just have a few degrees left. And so when we try to fit 5 tetrahedron around this, we just get a little bit bending in 4-dimensional space. And we will need, as we will see, a whole lot of these tetrahedra to make it actually work out. So we can start out with 3 tetrahedra and ask what happens if we forcefully, bend that into a corner. Can we repeat it? And the answer is we will get the simplex, or the 5-cell. So because of the projection, it becomes just a 3-dimensional object, and it loses some of its symmetry. So we have 5 vertices, but the 5th one, to make it as symmetrical as possible, I put here right in the middle. So we get the outer tetrahedron, and then we get the dimples here on each side. They all represent additional 4 tetrahedra, and they don't look very regular, and that's because of the projection. But in 4-dimensional space, all 5 of these tetrahedra are completely regular, and so that's the 5-cell, or the simplex. That's what happens when you take 3 tetrahedra around the shared edge and essentially force out the empty space and bend them into a true 4-dimensional corner. 4 tetrahedra around the corner, we get this object here. Okay? It's polytope, and it's actually the dual of the hypercube that you've seen before. Okay? So that's the cross polytope, the second regular polytope in 4 dimensions. 5 tetrahedra, put it around the shared edge, you get something that has a lot of tetrahedra. As a matter of fact, this thing has 600 tetrahedra. Most of them are sort of crunched up in the middle here because of the projection, and you just see one giant tetrahedra on the outside, and then adjacent to each faces you see smaller, fairly much flattened out tetrahedra, and you have to just believe me that they're essentially, in addition to this one out here, another 599 tetrahedra. This is called the 600 cell. 6 tetrahedra would exceed the dihedral angle of 360 degrees, and that's like, something warped that is not regular, so that's of no use. We have seen cubes. They have dihedral angles of 90 degrees. 3 of them will fit around an axis, still leave an open gap, and then we fold this one up. We've seen we get the hypercube. If you try to put 4 cubes around the joint axis, you can readily visualize that would readily fill the space without any bending, and so you can tile all of 3-dimensional space with that, but it will never bend and make a regular polytope polytopes in the higher dimension. So we're done with the cubes. The next Platonic solids will be polytopes in the higher dimension. All of three-dimensional space with that, but it will never bend and make a regular polytopes in the higher dimension. So we're done with the cubes. The next Platonic solids we may want to try is the octahedron. It has a dihedral angle of 109.5 degrees. So that's less than 120 degrees here, and that means we can indeed fit three around a joint edge and still leave a little bit open space, which we can squeeze out and make this then pop into the fourth dimension. And the result is what I believe to be the most beautiful four-dimensional regular polytope. The 24 cell made up of 24 octahedra. You can see the outermost octahedron because I chose that to be, preserved in the projection. But then you see these rather flattened octahedra with one triangle here, another triangle, the small one here, and sort of a distorted antiprism in between. And then they're more on the inside. I really like this particular object the most because it's not too complex. You can still see what's going on. You can still look on the inside and see the innermost very tiny little octahedron at the center. Now it turns out this object has 1,152 symmetries in four-dimensional space. And you simply get that by multiplying the symmetries of an octahedron, which are 48, with the number of octahedra, 24, multiply this out, you get 1152, because you can take, in four-dimensional space, any one of the octahedron and put it in place by suitable rotation of any one of the other 24 octahedra in any one of the 48 possible positions. I live at the street address 1152. And when I found out that this object has 1152 symmetries, I thought that somehow fate really meant me to be into geometry. The next one on the list is the dodecahedron, with 116.5 degrees of a dihedral angle. That is still less than 120 degrees, so we can still force three of them around an edge and then join them into a valid four-dimensional corner. It's not bending all that much, and so we will need 120 of those objects in the crust to form a valid four-dimensional regular polytope. So this is a model of the 120 cell. Of course, you can see the outermost dodecahedron. You can also see kind of this flattened pancake-like, dodecahedron on top here, and each one of the faces has one of those, and then stacked on the inside, there are a few more, adding up to a total of 120 of those. We still have the icosahedron. Unfortunately, it has a very shallow dihedral angle. It is more than 120 degrees. It is actually 138 degrees roughly. And so even three of them would not fit around this edge without overlapping. And so we cannot form a valid corner. And unfortunately, this is useless as far as making a four-dimensional regular polytope. You basically can figure it out yourself, right? You know how to make five-dimensional regular polytopes. You look at the four-dimensional regular polytopes, look at their dihedral angles and figure out, can I fit at least three of them around an edge so I can make one. Most of these regular polytopes in four dimensions are very round and are not very useful. There are really only two of them that actually hope of generating a new regular polytopes in higher dimension. One of them is the simplex, or the 5-cell, and the other one is the hypercube.
The other ones have got too shallow.
Yeah, the other one have too shallow dihedral angles, and they just don't make valid corners in the next dimension. And so from 5 dimensions onwards, there are really only just 3 regular polytopes in each one of these dimensions. One is the simplex series. You can always make a simplex. By taking a simplex in a particular dimension, I'm starting with the tetrahedron, and then I put another vertex at the center of gravity. And now I use the 4th dimension and essentially raise this vertex up in the 4th dimension until it has exactly the same distance from all the other 4 vertices. That makes a new simplex. And then I can take that particular simplex, put the new vertex at its center, raise it up into the next higher dimension until it is exactly the same distance from all the previously existing vertices, and make the next simplex. That always works. So I can work my way up to infinity by always making an additional simplex in exactly that manner. The problem now is, how do we depict those things? Because clearly projecting it down, it could do anything. So it's how do we make a model that has the right connectivity, even though geometry is sort of bogus at this point because it's so much distorted from what we originally had. And I have made a few more simplices in higher dimensions. You just need to always add one more vertex. And then figure out how to make a nice little graph that will get the right connectivity. So this one has 6 vertices. I claim this is a projection of the 5D simplex, because the simplex also is the complete graph. Every vertex is connected directly to every other vertex. You can see in this case, you start at any one vertex, there are 5 edges going off, one to each of the other vertices. So we want to make a 3D model that has 6 corners, is reasonably symmetric, but not too symmetric. So we could start with an octahedron, but in the octahedron then, when you connect opposite vertices, those 3 edges would all intersect in the middle. That would be so nice, you wouldn't see what's going on. So I had to deliberately distort this octahedron, warp it a little bit, so that those 3 space diagonals that go through the middle of the regular octahedron, they are separated out, and now they do not intersect with each other anymore. So the trick was really just finding 6 vertices in a relatively symmetrical arrangement so we can connect every one with every other one without any intersections. And that's the game that we have to play for every one of the dimensions that we want to build a simplex model. We already had this object that had 6 vertices completely connected, the warped octahedron, and that actually has an extra free space in the center. And it's so easy, therefore, to put a 7th vertex right here in the center. This one can again be connected to all the other vertices, and so now we have a complete graph of 7 vertices, and that would be a nice model of a 6-dimensional simplex. There is a second sequence that works for all dimensions, and it's called the measure polytope or hypercube sequence. The cube is the object with which we measure the volume of 3-dimensional space, just like the square is the geometric element that we use to measure 2-dimensional space. Similarly, the hypercube would measure 4-dimensional space. So the measure polytopes are always the equivalent of a cube in in the higher dimensions. And the best way of visualizing what's going on is essentially going in stepwise in extrusions. So we start with a line, and then we take this line, extrude it basically into a square, and then we sort of take that square and extrude it perpendicular to itself into a cube, and then we're doing one more extrusion of that cube into a hypercube, doing extrusion of the hypercube into the 5D measure polytope, and you could continue that. What I prefer, maybe in 6 dimensions, would be to take a regular cube and essentially sweep it in 3 different dimensions to make sort of a thickened cube frames, which is showing every edge as the sweep path of one of those cubes. So this particular diagram would be a depiction of a six-dimensional hypercube, which you get by extrusion. Another projection of the six-dimensional hypercube results in this rhombic triacontohedron, which has 30 rhombic faces on the outside, but on the inside there's a whole lot of intersecting edges going on, and you may not like that. So it all depends on out of your model. In some sense, this makes a very nice climbing structure for children.
Doesn't look very cubey though, does it? It's hard to see the cube.
Yeah, from some angles, if you look at here, it looks like an oblique, kind of squashed cube that starts as one of the cube face, or a very flattened cube. You know, you have just like three faces here, and then on the inside there will be another three flat faces, but they of course already intersect as edges from some of the other cubes.
We can go cubes all the way to infinity.
That is correct. So, you know, we started out with the 5 platonic solids, we went to the 6 regular polytopes in 4 dimensions, and after that I said 3, 3, 3, 3, 3. I have shown you 2 of those 3 series, the simplex series, and then the so there must be another one. We've seen that we can make a series of measure polytopes through 3 series, the simplex series, and then the measure polytope series. So there must be another one. We've seen that we can make a series of measure polytopes through all the dimensions. In each one of these dimensions, we can also form the dual. Just like in 3 dimensions, its dual, which is the octahedron. If I hold it that way, you can see the top and bottom vertex. Is the octahedron. If I hold it that way, you can see the top and bottom vertex. It corresponds to the top bottom face in this particular cube. For each of the 6 faces in the cube, I now have a vertex, and for each of the vertices in the cube, I now have a face.
Like an evil twin.
Yeah, oh, nice twins actually.
Yeah.
So they're duals of one another. We also have the models that show the same relationship, not quite as obvious, in 4 dimensions. So here we have the measure polytope, the hypercube, and if we take the 8 cubes in the crust of the hypercube and replace them by 8 vertices, we get the corresponding measure polytope, which is the dual to this hypercube.
Evil twin.
And the same principle goes on. It gets, you know, near impossible to kind of visualize in higher dimensions, but again, every measure polytope in D dimension is made out of measure polytopes of D minus 1 dimension. We replace each one of those cells with a vertex at its center. The cross polytope, which is the dual to the measure polytope in any one of these dimensions. And that's the 3rd series that we can form. Here is again our sequence. You know, we have infinitely many polygons in 2 dimensions. We have 5 platonic solids in 3 dimensions, 6 polytopes in 4 dimensions, and from there on it's just always only 3 regular polytopes. So in conclusions, I think I can say we're so lucky that we live in one of the 2 dimensions where it's really interesting and we have a variety of different regular polytopes.
We don't live in the most interesting dimension though. We live in the second most interesting.
Well, if you think that we live in space-time continuum, which is 4-dimensional, so we live in that one too.
Yeah. We live in the second.
The regular polytopes.
We don't live in the most interesting. Dimension though. We live in the second most interesting.
Well, if you think that we live in space-time continuum, which is 4-dimensional, so we live in that one too.
Yeah.
So I'm inside a 4-dimensional polytope right now.
Yes, you're inside the 120 cell. Space is entirely filled with
мелки не покупаешь.
Человеку удалось сделать сначала одну популярную
time. Which is true, but it's not.
Reinforcement. Что-то там ничего не это самое загрузилось.
Вам выслала оплату за сегодняшний урок. Скажите, пожалуйста, если вы ее получили.
Ну, пожалуйста. Ну напиши уже, да. Ну вот это есть на самом деле, нет, наоборот. Ну не пиши тогда. Наоборот, не надо. Значит, нет, наоборот, наоборот. Наоборот, ну нет, наоборот. Нет. Не пиши уже тогда ничего, значит надо играть и все просто, да. Вот оно, да. Я не знаю, это нормально играет, значит он, да. Ну нет, ну наоборот, ну наоборот. Ну надо это не думать, да, это не думать. Ну наоборот, вот она и думает это так, да, вот это и есть на самом деле. Ну вот это было нормально, значит, да. Наоборот, ну нет, нет. Что ты умный, что ли? Так нельзя так писать тогда наоборот. Наоборот, значит знает она уже все, ты давно знаешь. Наоборот, значит. Значит знает, что ее так не надо писать этого тогда. Ну а зачем? Ну нет, не знает она тебя просто все, да. Издеваешься, что ли? Ты надо мной издеваешься? Ну нет, этого я не знаю. Что ты смотришь, что за тебя смотрит. Ну наоборот, значит, нормально играет, значит.
Если вы умеете создавать бизнесы, которые приносят пользу людям, например, SMM-агентство, HR-агентство, диджитал-агентство, интернет-магазины, то это можно продать.
Рискованно. Рискованно. Но я не обязан. Что это мне каждый раз все надо бросать, что ли? Ну, я понял. Невозможно. Надо, значит... Лучше делать, значит. Надо делать по существу. Слышно, что было, слышно зоопарк. Что ты можешь предложить лучше? Explainingly bad. Bad news for you. You're done. You're not reply. All done. Боржуй, значит, не боржуй.